Thank you very much for coming on this very characteristic Manchester evening. So as Kevin said, about 3.5 years ago I had the honour of doing the first of these Sarah Fielden events, which was also my inaugural lecture at the University of Manchester. And looking back on that, I recall that I signalled an intention in my work at Manchester to do a kind of academic work which was going beyond policy critique and engaged with policy making locally in real time. And I'm very pleased to say that thanks to the generous funding of the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and the University of Manchester, I have been able to attempt this in the last 3.5 years, and the offering tonight is very much in that vein. So today we are launching at the Inclusive Growth Analysis Unit this briefing paper, which is based on a longer report about education and skills in Greater Manchester. You can get the longer report off our website here if you're interested. And the work's based on two things. It's partly based on the academic work that I've been doing over the last 15 years or so on education, poverty and inequality, and on the work of many of my colleagues here in the Disadvantaged and Poverty Research Group at Manchester, but also on some new analysis that I've been doing on the Greater Manchester system, where the contribution is not, to be honest, the depth or the novelty of that research. It's trying to bring, its breadth. It's trying to bring all the bits of the system together in one report. And the aim of the work really was two things. One was to try and see if there was a shared understanding of some of the issues that we face in Greater Manchester. And the second was to try and stimulate debate about what might be done. And my technique for stimulating debate about what might be done was to say what I think should be done. And I think they're reasonably sensible suggestions, although the more I look at them, the less sensible I think they are. But more importantly, I hope they would flush out comments like, no, not those things, other things, and that they would be the start of a conversation that might help move the city region forward a bit. So in that vein, with that expectation, I'm going to try and leave lots of time for discussion tonight. But I do want to start by rewinding a bit to that lecture 3 years ago and some of the points that I made then. So the first thing I said was that devolution is a big opportunity to rethink the contribution of education to economic and social goals in Greater Manchester, to try and resist the fragmentation of the education system into an endlessly complex set of individual consumer provider relationships, and to try and think about a whole system approach to what we're trying to achieve with this system in the city region. I said that not because I thought that DFE policy was about to spin into reverse, but because I thought devolution would open up a space for that kind of broader thinking about what is the kind of place that we want to live in and how do we work together across the city region to deliver it. And I'm hopeful about that, actually. And in connection with that, I made a perhaps unpopular statement, which was that rethinking education in Greater Manchester can and should be coupled with rethinking the economy in Greater Manchester. That isn't to say that I think that education is all about the economy, but GM has and it has increasingly making strategic commitments to a more inclusive economy. And I think this should cause us to think about what kind of education system that demands. And I talked about the example of Finland, where a rethink of the kind of skills and dispositions that would be needed in the tech economy as that country reinvented its economy. And they talked about things like creativity, open-mindedness, collaboration, freedom from fear of failure, avoidance of anxiety. These are things that are needed in those kinds of industries. And those conversations with business form one of the elements of the redevelopment of the current Finnish education system. And as people will know here, Finland performs consistently well both on excellence and equity in international tests. But children in Finland have fewer hours of schooling and less homework than most countries. They have no standard tests till school leaving age. There's very heavy investment in inclusion, special education and counselling. Teachers have very high autonomy, and they try to develop pedagogies. Teachers develop pedagogies, which I'll just underline that point, that encourage creativity, problem solving, and responsibility. And one of the architects of Finland's education transformation argued, I love this quote, a relaxed culture of learning and a lack of stress and anxiety play a role in the achievement of good overall results in Finnish schools. And I hope that when I come back for my next Sarah Fielden lecture, I will be able to say a relaxed culture of learning and a lack of stress and anxiety certainly play a role in the achievement of good overall results in Greater Manchester schools. So these might be some of the conversations, I think this conversation we might be having that connect the economy and the education system. And then the final thing I said in my last attempt at this topic was that nearly 30 years of English education policy should tell us that doing more of the same better, i.e. increasing standardisation, narrowing curriculum and increasing accountability won't lead to more social mobility or greater educational equality, even with some modest redistribution of resources. We can't just do more of the same better by increasingly ratcheting up the pressure on teachers and schools. We have to do something different. So the question really now is, can we do anything different at a local level? And does Devolution help with that? So I know some people have to rush off tonight. You won't miss anything. I'm going to say those three things again. But I'm just going to try and put a bit more flesh on the bones and say it a bit simpler. And in the spirit of the age, I'm going to try and do it in 5 tweets. So if you are tweeting, here's your first one. I'll be monitoring it. So the first tweet is that equity must be at the heart of the GM education and skills system. And this is where I just bring in some of the facts and figures about the system. I want to say up front that I don't believe that these end of a key stage academic attainments reflect equity in the education system. I think in some way they are a proxy for some of the other kind of injustices and inequalities that are going on. They are certainly a signifier of future life chances. But I'm not, we look at them because they're there and other measures aren't there. I also want to say, in the report I do talk about gender inequalities and about ethnic inequalities, but I'm not talking about those tonight just for reasons of time. So probably quite a familiar graph, free school meals versus non-free school meals, and the gap, if you look at the gap in green, it's big in early years, 17 percentage points, it widens during school age. These are kind of familiar kinds of figures, and if we go into just a little bit more detail, here are a bunch of 15-year-olds in Greater Manchester state schools. Some are eligible for free school meals, some are not. By the end of Key Stage 4, 39% of the free school meal cohort will have achieved level 2. By 19, only 47% of them will have achieved level 2. And this is what one of the symptoms of what my colleague Lorna Unwin, our colleague Lorna Unwin, talks about treading water in the period between 16 and 18 for young people who haven't achieved the magic A stars to C in GCSE. And so we know in Greater Manchester that around 40% of those in GM further education colleges haven't achieved that benchmark, don't achieve a higher level of learning by 18, any higher level of learning, not just necessarily a GCSE. So there's an awful lot of resource in FE going into GCSE resits, but the outcome is treading water. And then looking further along, we have a huge gap in access to higher education and an even bigger gap in access to higher ranking universities. And if you start, these are national figures, I think, because of sample size, but if you start looking at intersections between gender, ethnicity, place and free school meal status, you get these enormous gaps. The white free school meal young men in the lowest participation neighbourhoods, only 7% will go to university, compared with 60% of Asian non-free school meal young women in the highest participation neighbourhoods. So these are huge, a university is not the route for everybody, but there are huge issues going on in the post-16 phase. And just to make, I really want to make kind of 3 key points about these data. The first is that the gaps are almost the same as they are nationally. Normally, when you say that, people are surprised, because we have a narrative here which is that we are in a failing education system and we're way behind the national average. We're not. They're not closing, but they're not closing nationally either. So our GM performance is pretty much at and tracking the national problem, which should tell us that it's about more than what we are doing in Greater Manchester. And this graph here that shows that closing these gaps would have substantially more impact on attainment than raising overall GM figures to the national level, which is the usual policy aspiration and the one currently in Greater Manchester. So this is just, it's a very crude calculation. If you raise the attainment level GM of everybody to the national average, you'd actually get fewer people attaining these benchmarks in HE participation at 19, and rather more at age 16 and age 11. Less at age 11. But if you raise, you can see the red bars, if you raise the free school meal performance to the non-free school meal, you are achieving far more impact on the overall problem. So if all GM is interested in increasing its stock of human capital, this is where it should be focusing, not on trying to ratchet up to the national average, even if we think the national average is where it needs to be. And as I said, this seems to be a surprise. Most people think that we've got it all wrong here, and it's a failure story. What about adults? Again, people are often surprised to know we're not that far off national levels in terms of adult qualifications, but we are below on these measures. So the top 2 lines show Greater Manchester in the green and England in the purple on people with an NVQ4 qualification and above. And there we're about 3 points off the national level, and that's staying about the same. On people who've got no qualifications, the bottom 2 lines, we are about 2 percentage points off the national level, and that is narrowing. There's a lot to be said about these. Those of you who work in adult ed will note the steep change in the lines from 2008. Some of this may be the accreditation of skills that people already have. Qualifications aren't the same as skills, and I don't think our data shows us this. Another thing to say is that there are a lot of adults here, where there were only about we were in the hundreds to thousands of people in a cohort of children going through in each year. This is the 16 to 64 population, so 3% difference between the national average. That's 50,000 adults who, if we were at the national average, would be qualified. So there's a lot of adults here who have lower qualifications than is typical in the population as a whole. So that's a lot of adults who will be at risk of non-employment or of low-wage employment, or being unable to progress at work. And in that context, adult learning starts in Greater Manchester have fallen by a fifth over the last 5 years due to cuts in funding. So this is certainly an area where what we're doing nationally and locally isn't going to have the right effect. Another issue we need to look at in Greater Manchester is spatial inequalities. So this is the adult picture again, 16 to 64. The red is the level 4 plus again, the blue is the low qualifications. There are huge spatial disparities in adult qualifications, which are a reflection, of course, of industrial employment, geography of industrial employment, also about where better off people can afford to and want to live. So people move into nicer residential areas, more expensive residential areas, taking their qualifications with them. But since most of our 2040 workforce is in this graph, and only a few of them are in schools, it's absolutely fundamental, if we're trying to work towards a geographically inclusive economy in Greater Manchester, that we do something about this graph. But it's also important and depressing to note that the same sorts of gaps are appearing all through the education. I'll just show you age 5 here, but I've done it for all of the things. So we've got now a 13 percentage point difference between the highest and lowest ranking local authority on percentage reaching good level of development at age 5 this year. And the sharp-eyed will notice that even though I shuffled the order up, that the local authorities that are historically, the lowest levels of education attainment and qualifications on this graph are also the ones on this graph. So current things to do as well as history. And then finally on these kind of stats, I put this politely, there are lessons to learn from all around the system. Things aren't always exactly as you expect here. So I've shown here the percentage of children on free school meals reaching these different benchmark levels at age 5, 16 and access to higher education. And some perhaps surprising things emerge if you look at the age 5 bars, for example, children on free school meals are doing better in some of the more disadvantaged local authorities where on average attainment might be expected to be worse. But then over here we find that in Trafford, for example, we've got lower access of children on free school meals, young people on free school meals to university than we have in some of the more disadvantaged local. And there are explanations for this in terms of social segregation in schools and colleges, in terms of and neighbourhoods. Yeah, I won't go off that. We'll never finish. But so perhaps they are in a way what you'd expect. But it's there's a kind of nuanced picture. We might want to look at what some of these local authorities are doing. We may have the kind of lessons that are being learned in London in terms of the achievement of disadvantaged children in areas where there are a lot of them. This could be something to do with the expertise of people in those institutions. So finally on this point, I just want to say, what I'm trying to indicate here is that this is the area that we need to concentrate on in GM, and as Mel always says, this isn't an alternative to concentrating on the people who are doing least well at the moment. Isn't an alternative to overall improvement. It is what will drive overall improvement, not just in the numbers, but in the acquisition of professional expertise and its spreading across the system. Because if you can gain the expertise to deal with the most difficult challenges, and you can spread that knowledge across the system, the capacity in the whole system will improve, and other people will benefit. But at the moment, as I've often said, the learning in our system goes the other way around. So we tend to learn from the schools which are so-called and the colleges which are so-called successful, but are often in much more advantaged circumstances, whereas the professionals who are working in the more challenging circumstances are often told that they are not successful and they're failing and they don't have the opportunity to spread their expertise to somewhere else. So I think these figures quite clearly demonstrate that if we want to do something different here and make a difference, we shouldn't be thinking about the national average, we should be concentrating on inequalities. So that's the first one. I'm using inequalities and equity very loosely to be discussed, right? The second tweet is equity isn't already at the heart of the English education and skills system. So this is a point that carrying on, trying to drive up standards and so on is not going to make the difference. This slide was done last night when I was obviously something the matter with my brain. I was trying to say here, I think, that in the hearts and minds of people, in the GM education system, I think equity is at the heart of the system. It's hard to meet someone who doesn't have those kinds of aspirations about giving everybody the best chance and giving people an equal chance. But in the system is not set up to deliver equitable outcomes. So there's some disconnect here between what people are trying to achieve and how the system is enabling them to do it. And this isn't our Greater Manchester problem, it's a national problem. So what do I mean by a system not fundamentally designed for equity? These will be very familiar arguments to many people in this room. So, and the list could go on and on and on. So these were the ones I've picked though. First of all, the privileging of what we call the royal route. University to higher education to well-paid job, and the historic underfunding of the 16 to education and adult education and training systems. I just want to show you these figures from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which really illustrate this. In 1991, spending per student in FE was nearly 50% higher than spending per student in secondary schools. But in 15-16 it's 10% lower. And perhaps even more shocking in terms of the sort of relative decline of FE funding. By the time it's further declined to 2020, spending per student will be at the same level in real terms as it was 30 years ago, at the same time as national income has gone up 77% in real terms, and total public spending has gone up 93%. So this is a very clear indication. Hi, Gabrielle. It's a very clear indication of where our priorities are. My colleagues at LSE always used to say, why do you spend so much time looking at public spending? Because public spending is realised policy. We put our money where our mouth is, and clearly 16 to 18 education isn't deemed as important. Second thing, something I've written quite a lot on before, is that we have basically a universal system plus add-ons, not a fundamental redistribution of resources, either human or financial, according to need. So we haven't set out to say, how do we give everybody in the education system an equal chance to fulfil their potential, achieve their goals, etc. We say a school is a school is a school. They have roughly so much money per pupil, which is about the same. They roughly have classes which are about the same sort of size, with the same numbers of teachers allocated, and we to those, and they have roughly the same sort of things happen in them, and they have the difference, the add-ons, is in the kind of support stuff and so on. So we've got a remainder of moving to a welfare state, a universal system from one which wasn't universal. But we've never set out to fundamentally redistribute this to give an equal chance. We're providing what looks like a kind of equal education, but of course it isn't really. So and if you just start to if you just start to look at some of the details about what actually happens, is, well, we know, for example, that teachers in the schools in the most disadvantaged areas can't have some difficulties recruiting and retaining staff at all, but also recruiting and retaining experienced staff. We also know that within schools, now Rebecca Allen's recent research, less experienced teachers are allocated to the neediest learners, whereas more experienced teachers are in other schools or allocated to students who are going to get the results. So we've actually got a distribution of resources away from need towards lower need. But when do we ever sit down and say we need to fundamentally address this? We need to get class sizes down to really no numbers in areas where students have more need and of attention. So that's a kind of fundamental problem with the system. We've got a high stakes system which fixes failure for people who start at a disadvantage, because they're not, as soon as it's recognised, they're not going to get the magic results. They're no longer valued by the school, and they know that. Another problem is we've got a system that's based on institutional accountability. There's 2 points here. It's based on institutional accountabilities, not collective accountabilities, and becoming more so. And also it's a system based on accountability at the end of phases. So we've chunked our system. So in the early years, you're only responsible to that child's 5 on the measures that you're measured by. And then somebody else is responsible after 16, and so on. So we've got no sense of collective accountability for all the children and young people in our system. And we've blocked ourselves from having a focus on progression, which is totally opposite of what's happening to the learner. I think that's probably one of the major difficulties that we've got now. The obsession with measurement at 16 is one of the major difficulties that if we would go back to 14 to 19 upper secondary and lower tertiary phase, it would make much more sense. Many colleagues here have written about this, a system with pressures now to actually deny the social determinants of educational outcomes. I've been trying to avoid the social determinants of educational outcomes in this talk, because that's all I ever talk about is the social determinants of educational outcomes, Alan Dyson's phrase. But most of what happens in school, most of what drives educational attainment is what happens outside the school. But we have a system that has been set up for at least 20 years to pressurise professionals not to recognise those, because they seem to be making excuses for failure. And we've developed quite, in my view, quite a damaging discourse in some educational institutions about education institutions almost trying to protect children from communities and families. And if we can only keep those people away, we could get on with the job that we're trying to do in the school, which is get people these educational outcomes. And then the final point that I want to make and go on to is we've got a system that's currently obsessing about what works, but it's forgotten to look at what doesn't work. This is how I've sort of been thinking about this. What's causing these entrenched and persistent and large inequalities is not how we spend the pupil premium on interventions that will catch people up a few months. It's the core business of schools. It's curriculum, pedagogy and relationships, and other people might want to write some other core business school on this elephant. But the equity effects of the core business of schools are not being recognised, analysed, and acted upon. So somebody said the other day at a conference I was at that we measure quality in the early years, I think by sort of system quality and process quality. Process quality is what they do when they're actually there. I thought that was an astonishing, and of course you said that's what we should be measuring. I thought that was an astonishing point that we've got to when we have to say what we should be measuring is what they do when they're actually there. And I think I think the tide is beginning to turn now, and I wanted to perhaps you don't agree, but I thought what happened on Friday, Amanda Spielman's speech at the Festival of Education was tremendously important. I know everybody went to see it, so I want to inject a hopeful note by quoting her at length. Because coming from this quarter, this is quite significant. I'm not going to read it out. I'll let you read. There's 4 or 5 slides of this. That last thing is a breath of fresh air in its own. So what does she think really matters for good education? The curriculum. She's not frightened to point the finger either. Most of us, if our job depends upon it, will try and give ourselves the best chance of securing that outcome. So you go, girl. So what she says is that she's going to stop Ofsted inspectors inspecting sort of grades and data. They're going to be inspecting curriculum. They're going to be inspecting the substance of what goes on in classrooms. So this is, I mean, if she manages to do this, I think this will send some. It'll be, you know, we might start to see in a current climate of fear about trusting your professional judgment and doing what you think would really benefit the learners in your classroom. She might be giving people a license to do this. So what's that got to do with equity? Perhaps it's obvious that these depleted. I mean, I think she could have talked more about pedagogy. It's not all about curriculum, but give her a chance. She's gone a long way there. But the combination of a depleted curriculum and what Bob Lingard calls pedagogies of indifference, they are happening everywhere, but they are tending to occur most in schools in poorer areas, which are under greatest pressure to secure their results and to secure a good Ofsted inspection. That's the first point. And so other scholars have talked about these as pedagogies of poverty, because they are happening in areas where students and families are in poverty. And also they are impoverishing in themselves. But they also matter more, I would argue, for children and families with less educational capital, where what's happening in the school is a more important source. So I'm arguing that we need a system that not only distributes resources differently, very differently, but also fundamentally does something different. Right, so tweet 3, some of this could be changed locally, is what I'm saying. And we just held a round table around these kind of reports, and someone said at the end, maybe the question we should be asking is what's stopping us? And which of the things that are stopping us could we start to take apart? But we don't have an education and skills system to kind of engineer that change. We don't even have a school system. So okay, we never had one. So let's not. We never had a school system at GM level to align with kind of the new city region job. We had 10 school systems at different levels. But now we've got an incredible complex mix. These are the types of schools in different local authority areas in GM. They've taken very different approaches to academisation. I mean, the most obvious examples here are Manchester, which doesn't have any community secondary schools anymore. One. Which one is a secondary school? Abraham Moss. Why is it not in this data? How odd. I will chase that up. And Bury, which has the majority of its schools are still run by the local authority. And Trafford is another interesting case, which had an awful lot of foundation schools, which have now become converter academies. So they've taken very different routes, which means that the arrangements for supporting schools are in practice incredibly diverse. It's no longer even a system of 10. And in addition to these 10 local authorities, we've got at the moment 76 multi-academy trusts operating Greater Manchester. And they cover about a fifth of all schools. And most of the largest one has 10 schools in Greater Manchester. Most of those have only got 1 or 2 schools in Greater Manchester. Recall, they might have schools somewhere else. And I think we know from our own experience here that some of the better MATs are supporting schools very effectively, but their practice isn't necessarily being spread to other schools. But the Select Committee on Education found recently that there's a very variable quality in the support that MATs are giving to schools, and there's also this problem of untouchable schools that no MAT wants to have in the MAT. So we've got a regional schools commissioner whose job is to try and sort all of this out, but she covers the whole of Lancashire and West Yorkshire, so we don't even have an oversight at Greater Manchester level. of this. And what else? Who else? 4 universities, including us, doing involved in different ways in initial teacher training and CPD. 42 teaching schools also doing those things. 17 of which are in broader teaching school alliances, some aren't. We've got Teach First, trying to focus particularly on teachers in disadvantaged areas. We've got multiple providers of packages and interventions, from CPD to actual classroom interventions, mainly in the private sector, who are knocking on schools' doors and offering things which will close disadvantaged gaps. We've also got multiple charities. I hadn't really kind of realised this till the other day, partly because of I think maybe central government's lack of attention to reducing education inequalities. We've got, people have stepped into that space. There's an awful lot of charities who are trying to do that, and some of whom are also kind of providers and sellers of packages and so on, and that's just schools. So we've also got over 2,000 early years providers, who most of them are private 10 FE colleges, 400 of these 340 apprenticeship providers, mainly not offering many apprenticeships each, and again 4 universities plus oversight by Ofsted, the skills funding agency, etc. My spelling of quality has slipped there. So we don't have a system. We've got multiple systems and a complete lack of coherence, and we've also got weak structures for thinking strategically about the system as a whole, for joining up practice. It's not that we have no structures. We have, as a legacy of the Greater Manchester Challenge, we have a Greater Manchester Learning Partnership, we have a Skills and Employment Partnership, we have collaborations between providers of education like GM Hire and so on, but because we've got few powers and funding, we've not set up the GM-wide bodies, and we've got nothing that effectively includes all the phases of education. And then we've got underneath all that single institutional accountabilities and incentives, which are barriers to collaboration and create pervasive. So how do we try to change a system when we haven't got a system? Well, we do know, this is the tweet for, we do know that citywide, at least school systems have beneficial effects. I'm not going to talk long about this, but we've got a lot of evaluation evidence from the city challenges, because we had the GM challenge here about what these achieved and how they achieved it. So a key thing is the affective impact that these had on the system. Mel can talk about his own affective impact, but I was in London when Tim Brighouse was in charge of the London Challenge. He made a deliberate attempt. It started from a narrative of crisis. Tim Brighouse turned it round to wanting to make Greater London the best city education system in the world. He talked up the system. He tried to spread knowledge and energy and enthusiasm, and this sense that we're in something which can achieve things and transform the prospects of children and young people in the system was one of the things that was actually picked up in the evaluation. Another key thing was using data, because we've got that fragmented mess of a system. We have no intelligence function really that enables us to see the problems and move the resources to the right areas. Key thing in the GM challenge was the families of schools, moving knowledge around the system, engaging school leaders and advisors, school-to-school collaboration, and critically these last two things. So the GM challenges worked because they focused on disadvantage, and also they enabled schools to develop shared objectives for the system. So they enabled schools to go beyond their institutional incentive, talk about what do we want to try and achieve together. For instance, around raising aspirations, which probably wouldn't be exactly where I had to start. But that latter thing does sort of suggest that if you create a thing, and Mel often talks about the way that GM challenge was imposed on GM. So, but even then you got some of these effects about thinking collaboratively about the system. And this is another myth actually about Greater Manchester, that people often say Greater Manchester Challenge didn't achieve anything. So we don't want that back. So think about what we should do. Well, the mayor is on to some of this stuff. these are some things the Mayor said in his manifesto. He's on to school readiness. He's on to thinking about how resources are, resource cuts are affecting GM school. He's on to having a regional schools commissioner for GM, but unfortunately his line says the regional schools commissioner is going to drive up standards, which in my view is not going is not going to, if that's the focus of the regional schools commissioner, that's not going to affect anything that should be talking about. So he's talking about establishing a Greater Manchester curriculum for life to get around some of the difficulties of narrowed curriculum and focus only on attainment, but this is a curriculum of life which is extra to the core curriculum. He's not talking about changing the curriculum. He recognises the difficulties in the 16 to 18 landscape and proposes a UCAS style clearing system and reducing travel costs for young people. But there's what I'm saying to the Mayor in here is these are more sort of good initiatives to tackle bits of the system, but this is the last one. To make a step change in GM, we need a system, and we need to put equity at the heart of the system. So what the kinds of things that I'm suggesting that we might do here, what would it mean to start to put equity at the heart of the system? Well, the first thing would be a critical review of what is it that is getting in the way of greater equity. Not to go out and look for research on add-on things and that work. We have to look at what's not working, and then we have to say which of these things do we have it within our power to change locally. Second thing would be to build the knowledge, this is the hearts and minds, to build the knowledge, capacity and the confidence to do something different. What is it that's stopping us from doing something different? How can we break down a culture of fear and gain confidence from each other? And so one of the things that I think is key here, there's so much good stuff going on all over in pockets of the city region. Can we gather and share it? Particularly issues around curriculum, pedagogy and relationships. Can we get the elephant off the couch? And some key things there, school-to-school support, but also school and university partnerships. Can we go back to developing place-based multi-agency partnerships on a more systematic basis to address some of these social determinants? And we have got them in places, and Kirsten lots about that. How can we make them more systemic? And the combined authorities giving a good deal of attention now to integrated place-based working, so I think we have some opportunities to get back in here. And how about an equity audit of resource distribution? Where are the shortages of experienced teachers, disadvantaged areas? Where are the which schools are losing most through these funding cuts, and how could some of the things they're losing be replaced? How are apprenticeship opportunities distributed around the conurbation, and who's not getting access to them? That would be a start to focus on the pinch points. And then there's more in the report. And then the final thing that I'm saying is that has to be nested in a more systemic approach generally. People quite rightly said this afternoon that this paper sort of sets out this ideal sort of Stalinist regime. Well, that sort of isn't going to happen. But some of these things might happen. And one of them is to have an overall vision and strategy for education, not for skills, for early years. Schools, we're just nowhere near that. But an overall vision for education in the city. What would a learning city in Greater Manchester look like? What's it for? And that linking both to the social objectives of Greater Manchester and the economic objectives. So we can do that for health and social care. Why can't we do it for education? Some kind of oversight and coordination of system resources. Why aren't we reviewing provision and take-up according to need? Why haven't we got a GM overview of teacher supply and demand and local systems to support recruitment and attention to most challenging schools. Should we have a strategic approach to teacher education and professional development? The idea that in London Challenge had a London teacher idea, should we have a Greater Manchester teacher kind of thing, and that the standard that people could be working to. I don't mean standard in that kind of way, but and then probably the most important thing, as we're unlikely to dump the measures that we already have and the accountability systems that DFE runs, could we encourage or trial in places in the city region the use of some better measures, so ones that capture wider outcomes, and ones which go across phase, which capture transition and progress, not so much outcomes. Could we set those up in some places and demonstrate that if you concentrate on these things, you get better outcomes on the other ones as well, to try and negotiate the flexibilities with DFE. And there's more and more and more. Back to the principles of the Greater Manchester Challenge, a city regional knowledge sharing hub, the ability to identify and support struggling schools, whichever map they're in, or whether they're one of these untouchable schools. More systematic way of pulling down the resources of our city region, the cultural institutions, the businesses and so on, the charities, maximising more of what we've got in these places, our teacher training, our continuing professional development, our widening participation stuff, among others. And then the final thing, which is probably the most difficult, is that I just say the system from naught to adulthood has to be what's seen as one system. That's very difficult because, of course, all the funding streams and accountability streams are different, but at least if we could see it as one system, we might get some kind of strategic and shared view of priorities. We might start to be able to share expertise between phases, for example, between colleges and schools, and we might start to be able to develop collective accountability for outcomes. I'm beginning to realise this isn't possible, but maybe it is in some local areas. So my question, I've got two questions to you. Is what I've set out pie in the sky, or is it a glimpse of what the sunshine had? And the second question is, do you think my analysis of the issues and challenges is right? Are these the things that Greater Manchester should be focusing on? And kind of if so, how do we move forward? So I've finished. It would be great to hear. I know there's people in the room who are working from early years through to adulthood, people who are teacher educators, perhaps some teachers, perhaps some learners, people who work in policy, economic development. It would be great to have a range of perspectives on these things. Thanks.